Inside the church, after 35 years, I found what he hid, and the truth nearly broke me. For 35 years, she believed her husband's weekly church visits were nothing more than quiet devotion and simple faith. Every Sunday morning without fail, Richard would arrive at St. Michael's Cathedral an hour before services began, disappearing into the old stone building while she finished getting ready at home. He'd return to pick her up for the service looking peaceful, sometimes with red-rimmed eyes she assumed were from intense prayer and meditation. She never questioned it, never wondered what he did during that solitary hour in the empty church, never imagined he was hiding something profound in the shadows of that sacred space. But the day she stepped inside the dim, echoing room the pastor guided her to 3 weeks after Richard's sudden death from a heart attack, she discovered something he had hidden there for decades, something she had never been meant to find until he was gone and could no longer protect her from the truth. Inside a locked drawer in the tiny prayer room Richard had claimed as his private sanctuary was a small weathered wooden box, full of letters, photographs, and memories from a life he lived in, silence parallel to their marriage, a life full of secrets, sacrifices, unbearable pain, and choices he'd carried completely alone so she would never have to share the crushing weight of his burden. And as she read the truth contained in those yellowed pages, her knees buckled beneath her and she collapsed onto the cold stone floor. He wasn't the man she thought she'd married 37 years ago. He was someone infinitely braver, more selfless, more damaged, and more broken than she ever knew. And discovering who Richard really was after 35 years of thinking she knew everything about him nearly destroyed her completely. Before I reveal what was inside that wooden box and the devastating secret this woman's husband kept hidden in a church for 35 years, you need to stop everything you're doing and subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell, because this story will take you on an emotional journey so powerful you'll be thinking about it for weeks after you finish watching. I share real stories about hidden lives, profound secrets, and the sacrifices people make in silence every single week, and this one will absolutely wreck you in the most beautiful way possible. Smash that like button right this second, because your engagement helps these deeply moving stories reach people who desperately need to hear them, people who need to know they're not alone in carrying impossible burdens that nobody else can see. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever discovered something about someone after they died that completely changed how you understood their entire life and everything they went through? This is a true story. This happened to a real person. And I promise you that what you think is inside that box is not what's actually there. Stay with me until the very end, because the truth is more heartbreaking and more beautiful than anything you're imagining right now. My name is Patricia. I'm 62 years old. And 3 months ago, my husband Richard died suddenly at age 64 from a massive heart attack that took him without warning. We'd been married for 37 years, together since we were in our mid-20s, building what I thought was a life of complete honesty and transparency. I thought I knew everything about him, every story from his childhood, every dream he'd ever had, every fear that kept him awake at night. Thought his weekly hour alone at church before Sunday services was just his way of centering himself spiritually before worship, preparing his heart for the service ahead. I was wrong about all of it, and what I discovered in that locked prayer room 3 weeks after his funeral revealed a secret so profound, so heartbreaking, so incredibly selfless, that it nearly broke me into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. If you're already hooked on this story, hit that like button right now and leave a comment saying "Church Secret," because what Patricia discovers will absolutely devastate you. Richard and I met when we were both 25 years old. He was a high school English teacher, passionate about literature and helping students discover the power of words. I was a nurse working night shifts at the local hospital. We fell in love quickly, married 2 years later, built what seemed like a perfectly normal, happy life together. We had 2 children, a daughter named Emma, and a son named Michael, now adults with their own families and children. Richard taught for 40 years at the same high school, never seeking promotions or transfers, content to spend his career making a difference in the lives of teenagers. He was beloved by students, respected by colleagues, known throughout the community for going above and beyond to help struggling kids who had no one else to believe in them. We had a modest but comfortable life, Nothing extraordinary from the outside, but solid and good, and filled with love and laughter and the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. Richard's church routine started about 2 years into our marriage when we joined St. Michael's Cathedral. Every Sunday, he'd wake early and drive to the church, arriving around 8 a.m. for the 9:30 service. He'd spend that hour alone in the church, then come get me at 9:15 so we could attend service together as a couple. When I asked what he did during that hour, he'd say he prayed, meditated, prepared his heart for worship, reflected on the week that had passed. It seemed perfectly reasonable and normal. Some people need quiet time before communal worship. Some people have deeply personal prayer practices they prefer to do in solitude. I never questioned it further. Subscribe right now, because what Richard was actually doing during those solitary hours will shock you to your core. For 35 years, this pattern never changed or wavered. Even when we traveled on vacation, Richard would find a local church and arrive early to spend time alone before the service. Even when our children were young and Sunday mornings were chaotic with getting everyone ready, Richard maintained this routine without fail. Even during the years when his health started declining and he had less energy for everything else, he still dragged himself to church an hour early every single Sunday without exception. I thought it was beautiful devotion, thought my husband had an exceptionally deep prayer life and spiritual discipline, had no idea he was maintaining a secret so profound it required weekly private time in a sacred space to manage the overwhelming emotions it created. 3 months ago, Richard collapsed at school during his lunch break. Massive heart attack, sudden and fatal. He was dead before the ambulance arrived at the school. One moment he was healthy and alive, planning our summer vacation and grading student papers. The next moment he was gone forever, leaving me devastated and lost. The funeral was absolutely packed. Hundreds of former students came to pay their respects. Colleagues from 4 decades of teaching. Friends, family, community members whose lives Richard had touched. Everyone sharing stories about how Richard had impacted their lives in profound ways. How he'd stayed after school for hours to tutor struggling students who were in danger of failing. How he'd paid for a student's prom dress out of his own pocket when her family couldn't afford it. How he'd written detailed college recommendation letters on his own time for kids who had no one else to advocate for them. How he'd been a mentor and father figure to countless teenagers who had no stable adults in their lives. But even in the midst of overwhelming grief and beautiful eulogies, I noticed something strange and unsettling. During the funeral reception at the church, Pastor Williams kept looking at me with this odd expression, deep sympathy mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Concern, maybe, or knowledge of something important I didn't know. Finally, as people were leaving and the reception was winding down, he approached me quietly in a corner away from others. "Patricia, when you're ready and feeling up to it, I need to show you something Richard left in the church. He made me promise years ago that if anything ever happened to him, I would show you what he'd been keeping in the prayer room. It's important. Take your time grieving, but when you're ready, come find me. Leave a comment saying, 'What did he hide?' if you're desperate to know what Patricia is about to discover." I was confused, but agreed to come back the following week when I was less overwhelmed by fresh grief and the immediate aftermath of Richard's death. That Tuesday, Pastor Williams led me through the empty church, our footsteps echoing on the stone floors, to a small prayer room I'd walked past hundreds of times over 35 years but had never entered. It was tiny, barely larger than a closet, with a simple wooden kneeling bench, a small desk, and a single stained glass window that cast colored light across the floor. "Richard has been coming to this exact room every Sunday for 35 years, Pastor Williams explained gently. He'd lock himself in here for an hour before services. I gave him the only other key years ago and promised never to disturb him or ask questions about what he was doing. He said he needed this completely private space to manage something very difficult and deeply personal, and I respected that without requiring explanation." Pastor Williams pulled out an old brass key and opened the desk's locked drawer. Inside was a wooden box, maybe the size of a shoebox, worn smooth with age and decades of handling. He left very specific instructions that if anything happened to him, I should give you this box and this letter. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Richard's familiar handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on love notes and grocery lists for 37 years. My hands shook violently as I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was dated just 6 months earlier, as though Richard had some premonition that his time was growing short. It read, "My dearest Patricia, if you're reading this letter, I'm gone from this world. And Pastor Williams has given you the box I've kept hidden in this prayer room for 35 years of our marriage. I need you to know that everything in this box represents the hardest thing I've ever carried in my entire life. A burden I chose to carry completely alone so you would never have to share the crushing weight of it. I kept this secret not because I didn't trust you with my whole heart, but because I loved you too much to let this darkness touch your life and steal your happiness. Please forgive me for hiding this from you for so long, and please try to understand why I had to keep it secret. I love you more than anything in this world, more than my own life. Richard." Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now because what's inside this box will absolutely wreck you emotionally. I opened the wooden box with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. Inside were layers of items carefully preserved that told a story I never knew existed. On top was a photograph of a teenage boy, maybe 16 years old, who looked strikingly similar to Richard at that age. Same gentle eyes, same shy smile, same kind expression. On the back of the photo was written in Richard's handwriting, "Daniel Richard Thompson, my son, age 16. My breath stopped completely. Richard had a son? A biological son he'd never told me about in 37 years of marriage? How was that possible? I kept digging through the box with shaking hands. Found a birth certificate, yellowed with age. Daniel Richard Thompson, born when Richard was just 17 years old. Mother listed as Jennifer Thompson. I'd never heard that name before in my entire relationship with Richard. Found letters, dozens and dozens of them, carefully organized by year. Letters from Richard to Daniel spanning decades, covering Daniel's entire life from birth to adulthood. Letters that were never mailed, never sent, just written and carefully saved. Dear Daniel, you're 5 years old today. I wonder what you look like now, what your favorite toys are. Wonder if you ever think about me or if your new family never mentions that you were adopted. I think about you every single day. Dear Daniel, you're starting high school this year according to my calculations. I hope you're doing well in school. I hope your adoptive family loves you the way I couldn't when I was too young and scared. Dear Daniel, you're 25 now, the same age I was when I met Patricia, a grown man living your own life. I wonder what kind of person you've become, what career you chose, if you're happy. Wonder if you'd want to know me if I ever found the courage to reach out and explain everything. There were newspaper clippings carefully preserved, obituaries, and my heart completely shattered when I read the headline dated 3 years ago. Local high school teacher Daniel Thompson, 32, dies in car accident. The obituary described Daniel as a beloved teacher, husband, and father of 2 young children. Richard's son had died, and I'd never known he existed. Never known Richard was carrying this grief. Share this video immediately if this revelation is breaking your heart, because Patricia's discovery gets even more devastating. I found Richard's personal journal entries from that time 3 years ago, entries I'd never seen because he'd kept this journal hidden in the church. Daniel is gone. My son is dead, and I never got to tell him I loved him. Never got to explain why I gave him up for adoption. Never got to know the man he became or meet his children. My grandchildren I'll never know. The grief is completely unbearable, crushing me. But I can't share it with Patricia because then I'd have to explain why I kept him secret for our entire marriage. So I carry this alone. Come to this room every Sunday and let myself break apart for 1 hour before I go home and pretend everything is fine. This is how I survive. 1 hour a week to grieve, then back to normal life. I sat on the cold floor of that prayer room and sobbed until I had no tears left. Richard had a son from a teenage relationship before we met. A son he'd been forced to give up for adoption when he was just 17 years old. A son he'd thought about every single day for 35 years of our marriage. A son who'd died 3 years ago, and Richard had grieved completely alone in this tiny room for 1 hour every Sunday, never letting me see his pain or his tears, never asking me to share the burden of his loss. Pastor Williams knelt beside me on the floor as I cried. I'm so sorry, Patricia. I didn't know the specific details until Richard came to me 3 years ago, completely broken by his son's death. Told me Daniel had died, and he needed a safe place to grieve where no one would see him fall apart. This prayer room became his sanctuary, the one place he could be completely honest about his pain without burdening anyone else. Why didn't he tell me? I asked through tears and confusion. Why carry this alone for 37 years of marriage? Why suffer in silence? Pastor Williams handed me another letter from the box, this one longer and more detailed. I read it through tears that wouldn't stop flowing. Richard explained everything in painful detail. Subscribe and turn on notifications because Richard's hidden life of grief and sacrifice gets even more heartbreaking from here. When Richard was 17 years old, still in high school himself, he'd gotten his girlfriend Jennifer pregnant. They were terrified teenagers from strict religious families. Richard's parents forced him to give the baby up for adoption, said he was too young to be a father, that keeping the baby would ruin both their lives and futures. Jennifer's parents agreed completely. The baby, Daniel, was adopted by a loving family in another state through a closed adoption. Richard never saw him after the day he was born in the hospital. Never got to hold him or tell him goodbye. Just signed papers and walked away, heartbroken. Richard had carried the guilt and grief of that impossible decision his entire life. When we met 8 years later, he desperately wanted to tell me but was terrified I'd judge him harshly, think less of him for giving up his own child. As time passed and our relationship deepened, the secret became harder and harder to confess. By the time we were married, he felt completely trapped in the lie of omission. So he carried Daniel silently in his heart, thought about him constantly, wondered about him endlessly, but never searched for him because the adoption was closed, and he'd promised Jennifer he'd let their son have a fresh start with his new family. The wooden box contained 35 years of accumulated grief carefully hidden. Unsent birthday cards for every year of a son Richard never got to know or watch grow up. Newspaper clippings from when he finally found Daniel on social media years ago and learned his son had become a high school English teacher just like him. Photographs Richard had secretly printed from Daniel's Facebook page. Daniel with his wife, with his 2 children, living a full life Richard watched from a distance but could never be part of. And then the obituary. The end of any possibility of ever meeting his son, ever explaining why he'd given him up, ever telling Daniel that he'd been loved and thought about every single day of his life. The journal entries from the 3 years since Daniel's death were absolutely agonizing to read. Richard describing his grief as a physical weight crushing his chest every moment, describing the guilt of mourning someone he had no right to mourn publicly since no one knew Daniel existed, describing coming to this prayer room every Sunday and allowing himself exactly 1 hour to completely fall apart before going home and being the cheerful, stable husband I thought I knew. "This room saves my sanity and my marriage," he'd written. "For 1 hour a week, I can be completely honest about my pain, can talk to Daniel even though he's gone forever, can let myself feel the overwhelming grief without Patricia having to carry it or even know about it. She deserves a husband who's present and happy, not broken and grieving. So I come here, break apart completely, put myself back together, and go home. This is my gift to her, a marriage uncontaminated by my ancient grief and current devastation." Leave a comment saying, "Hidden Father," if Richard's secret grief is absolutely destroying you emotionally right now. I was completely devastated. Not because Richard had a son from before our marriage. I could have understood and accepted that easily. But because he'd suffered alone in silence for 35 years, thinking I couldn't handle the truth, thinking he had to protect me from his pain, carrying unbearable grief in secret because he loved me too much to burden me with his complicated past and ongoing loss. There were more items in the box that broke my heart further. A letter Richard had written to Daniel just days before his own death, as though he'd somehow sensed his time was running short. "Dear Daniel, I'm your biological father, though you never knew I existed. I gave you up for adoption when you were born because I was 17 and terrified and pressured by everyone around me. But not a single day has passed in 47 years that I haven't thought about you and wondered who you became. I've watched your life from a distance through social media, saw that you became a teacher like me, which filled me with pride, saw that you had a beautiful family and seemed genuinely happy. And then I learned 3 years ago that you died, and my grief nearly destroyed me completely. I'm writing this knowing I'll never send it, knowing you're gone from this world. but I need to say it anyway. I loved you from the moment you were born. I'm sorry I gave you up. I'm sorry I never had the courage to find you while you were alive. I hope you had a wonderful life. I hope you felt completely loved by your adoptive family. And I hope somehow, wherever you are now, you know that your biological father never stopped loving you or thinking about you. I spent hours in that prayer room reading every single item in the box, learning about the son Richard had loved from a distance for nearly 5 decades, understanding that every Sunday for 35 years, my husband had come to this sacred space and allowed himself to mourn the child he'd given up and the relationship he'd never have, that he'd discovered his son had died 3 years ago and had grieved completely alone, never letting me see his devastation because he didn't want to burden me with his ancient mistakes and complicated grief that I knew nothing about. Pastor Williams finally interrupted my reading as evening approached and the church was growing dark. Patricia, there's one more thing you should know about Richard. He made substantial anonymous donations to this church for many years. He specifically requested that the money be used exclusively to help teenage parents who wanted to keep their babies but needed financial support to make that possible. He funded childcare, diapers, formula, parenting classes, even rent assistance. Dozens of young families over the years were able to stay together and raise their children because of Richard's quiet generosity. He never wanted any credit or recognition, just wanted to make sure other teenagers didn't have to make the same impossible choice he'd made at 17. Hit that like button if you believe Richard deserved to know his son and grandchildren while he was alive, because this missed connection is absolutely tragic. I started crying all over again. Even in his grief and guilt, Richard had turned his pain into purpose and helping others, had helped countless young parents keep their children when everyone else told them they were too young, had tried to create different, better outcomes for others, even though he couldn't change his own past or undo his own loss, had carried his secret suffering and transformed it into quiet generosity that changed many lives. The next weeks were an absolute blur of processing this revelation. I contacted Jennifer, Daniel's biological mother, through social media with a carefully worded message. She was absolutely stunned to hear from me and grateful to learn that Richard had thought about Daniel constantly throughout his life. We met for coffee and she shared her own grief. She'd also given up Daniel under family pressure and had carried guilt and loss her entire life. She'd also discovered years ago that he died, also grieved him secretly and alone, also wondered constantly what kind of man he'd become and whether he'd had a happy life. Together, we located Daniel's widow through online searches and cautiously reached out to explain who we were, the biological parents of her late husband. Daniel had apparently known he was adopted, but had never searched for his biological parents, feeling deep loyalty to the wonderful family who raised him and not wanting to hurt them. But his widow said he'd sometimes wondered about the people who'd given him life and whether they ever thought about him. She graciously agreed to meet us and hear our stories. She even let us meet Daniel's children, Richard's grandchildren he'd never known he had, beautiful kids who carried his features and his gentle nature. I showed Daniel's widow all the letters Richard had written over the decades but never sent, the unsent birthday cards for every year, the journal entries describing his endless love and grief and guilt. She cried reading them, deeply moved. Daniel would have wanted to know his biological father, she said with certainty. He was an incredibly forgiving person with a huge heart. He would have completely understood why Richard gave him up and wouldn't have held it against him. I wish so much they'd had the chance to meet and talk. Daniel talked sometimes about wondering if his biological parents ever thought about him. Now I know at least his father thought about him every single day. I wished the same thing with all my heart. Wished Richard had trusted me enough to share this burden instead of carrying it completely alone for 37 years. Wished he'd been brave enough to search for Daniel instead of watching his life unfold from a careful distance. Wished he'd known his grandchildren before he died, these beautiful children who had inherited his love of teaching and literature. But I also understood why he'd kept the secret locked away. Richard had been just 17 when he'd given up his son, pressured by parents and circumstances completely beyond his control. That choice had marked him permanently, created a grief he'd carried every single day for 47 years. By the time we met and fell in love, the secret felt too enormous to confess, too shameful, too likely to change how I saw him and maybe destroy what we were building. So he'd created this separate, sacred space, 1 hour a week in a locked prayer room where no one could see, where he could be completely honest about his pain without contaminating our marriage with his overwhelming grief. Subscribe to this channel right now if you believe love sometimes means carrying burdens alone to protect the people you cherish most, because Richard's sacrifice shows the depth of his love. The wooden box now sits on my dresser where I can see it every day. I look at it constantly. Look at the fading photograph of Daniel and see Richard's gentle features reflected in a son he never got to know or hold. Read the unsent letters and feel the crushing weight of love Richard carried silently for decades. Process the complicated grief of losing a husband while simultaneously discovering he'd been grieving a hidden son our entire marriage. People ask if I'm angry that Richard kept this monumental secret from me. The truth is deeply complicated. Yes, I wish desperately that he'd trusted me with this pain and let me help carry it. Wish I could have supported him through his grief instead of him suffering completely alone in silence. Wish he'd felt safe being completely honest about his past and his ongoing loss. But I also understand that shame and guilt are incredibly powerful silencers, that Richard truly believed with all his heart he was protecting me by carrying this burden alone. That his weekly hour in that prayer room was ultimately an act of profound love, giving himself space to fall apart completely so he could come home and be fully present with me and our family. It's been 3 months since Richard died. 3 months since I discovered the wooden box and learned about Daniel and the secret grief Richard carried. 3 months of processing that my husband of 37 years had a whole separate life of pain I knew absolutely nothing about, despite thinking I knew everything. I've connected deeply with Daniel's family now, developed genuine relationships with Richard's grandchildren, shown them all the letters their biological grandfather wrote over the years, but never had the courage to send. They're getting to know Richard through his words, and through my endless stories about the incredible man he was. I've also taken over Richard's anonymous donations to help young parents in difficult situations, using money from Richard's life insurance policy to continue his beautiful legacy of turning his pain into purpose and helping others. Helping teenagers keep their babies instead of being forced into the impossible choice that marked Richard for his entire life. I visit that small prayer room at St. Michael's every Sunday now without fail. Spend my own quiet hour there before services begin. Sit in the exact space where Richard came to grieve and heal and fall apart every week for 35 years. Feel closer to him there than anywhere else. Sometimes I talk to him out loud. Tell him I understand now why he kept the secret. Tell him I forgive him completely for not trusting me with his pain. Tell him I love him even more now, knowing the weight he carried silently to protect my happiness. If this story has moved you deeply, if it's changed how you think about secrets and grief and the burdens people carry in complete silence, do something important right now. Hit that like button so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment. Share widely, because there are people suffering alone who need to know it's okay to share burdens. Inside the church, after 35 years, I found what my husband hid, and the truth nearly broke me. But it also showed me the extraordinary depth of his love. He gave me 37 years of happiness by carrying his immense sorrow completely alone. I'm Patricia. This is our story. The end.